Civilization has fallen. The great cities are burning. The armies of the world powers have been ground to dust. The fleets that once plied the oceans rest broken on the seafloor. What remains of humanity lives a meager existence, hiding in dark corners or silently scurrying to gather what scraps of the old world they can find. Humanity is no longer the masters of the earth. A new species has inherited the planet, monstrous and gargantuan beings that are too terrible to behold. They go by many names, but to the people who once inhabited the land of the rising sun, they can only be called one thing: Kaiju. Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrovich, the alternate historian, and happy Halloween to all my friends in the multiverse. Today we're talking about Kaiju, and specifically how you, my fellow alternate historian, can use them in your next story. For those who don't know, when I say Kaiju, I'm talking about your Godzillas, King Kongs, or whatever the Power Rangers fought. These giant monsters of Japanese cinema and television are mostly just someone in a rubber suit destroying a model city, or perhaps flailing at someone else in a rubber suit. And while that sounds silly, for a time this was cutting-edge special effects, and gave audiences the experience of what it would be like to be attacked by a giant monster. Now, giant monsters aren't anything new. There are several examples from myth, legend, and cinema that predate Kaiju. For example, the legend of St. George slaying the dragon, or Typhon of Greek myth. There were even giant monsters in film long before the Japanese tried their hand at it, such as the 1933 film King Kong, in which a giant ape terrorizes Manhattan, or the 1953 film The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, where stop-motion dinosaurs are awakened by atom bombs only to attack NYC. But let's be real, if I say giant radioactive dinosaur, there's only one person you're thinking of. The original Kaiju film was 1954's Gojira, aka Godzilla, which was a huge success in Japan and spawned an entire genre of film that was later dubbed into English and exported to America, which found an audience of nerds who loved the campy spectacle. But while giant monsters destroying cities and fighting each other can be entertaining in itself, Godzilla's popularity came in part because of what it represented. You see, Japan was still reeling from the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and to make matters worse, the American occupation authorities didn't really let anyone talk about it. Additionally, further nuclear testing in the Pacific increased fears regarding nuclear weapons in Japan, especially when a Japanese fishing boat accidentally wandered too close to Bikini Atoll in 1954, where the hydrogen bomb was being tested. The crew suffered radiation sickness afterwards, and one crew member died. And while, yes, Godzilla the film was made in part to capitalize on how well American giant monster movies were doing in Japan, seeing a giant walking atom bomb savage Tokyo also gave Japanese audiences a chance to deal with the horrors of nuclear weapons. Of course, fear of nuclear destruction may not be as acute as it was back in the 1950s, but Godzilla and other kaiju are still used as giant walking metaphors for our fears and anxieties. Depending on the society and time period, they can symbolize natural disasters, global tensions, science or technology run amok, pollution, climate change, and even racism and xenophobia. Which means that in a way, when a kaiju shows up to knock humans down a peg, it can be, and likely is, meant to represent something else that is scaring the audience. So go ahead, be Politico in your Kaiju alternate history. It's tradition. Speaking of which, Kaijus don't actually appear that much in alternate history, which, in case this is your first video of mine you ever watched, is a subgenre of science fiction where stories are set in a history that diverge from our own sometime in the past. That said, a recent example is John Scalzi's 2022 novel, The Kaiju Preservation Society, where kaiju exists on a parallel Earth where evolutionary history took a divergent turn. There's also the 2014 graphic novel, World War Kaiju, by Josh Finney and Patrick McAvoy, where the United States and the Soviet Union are in a kaiju arms race. And then there's also Peter Tarias's United States and Japan trilogy from 2016 to 2020, which is set in a timeline where the Axis powers won World War II. While the book focuses primarily on Japan's giant mecha, they still feature Nazi weapons called biomechs, which quite easily fit into the kaiju mode. This means there is room for more kaiju in alternate history, in case you are trying to think of something else to write about. Of course, alternate historians care a lot about plausibility, and kaiju are inherently implausible. For example, any kaiju story needs to ignore the square cube law. For those who don't know, and my apologies for what I get wrong, I'm an alternate historian, not a scientist, the square cube law governs how big something can become. So the bigger the surface area of an animal becomes, its volume will increase even faster. So the taller your giant monster gets, the fatter it will become, which means its bones will soon be unable to hold up its body against Earth's gravity, and its heart couldn't pump enough blood to where it needs to be. This is probably why the largest animals alive today are all whales, since living entirely in the ocean certainly helps support your gut. So, in your alternate history, you will either need to ignore this law, find a way to follow it, or try making the kaiju more plausible in other ways in order to distract your audience. For example, the kaiju in the Kaiju Preservation Society are less one single organism and are instead a collection of organisms that live on an alternate Earth that is much hotter, has a thicker atmosphere, and has a lot more radioactive elements that power their internal organic nuclear reactors. Alternatively, you can even change their shape. Kaiju like Godzilla and King Kong tend to be portrayed walking upright, despite the fact that the animals they are modeled after, i.e. dinosaurs or apes, do not walk like that. So having your giant lizard walk more like a T-Rex with their back parallel with the ground might make people more forgiving regarding the size issues. Unfortunately, this does mean that the monster from the 1988 film Godzilla is more plausible than the Japanese original. And if you're making your kaiju more similar to real animals, well then you can't ignore their behaviors and biology. Reptilian kaiju are probably going to spend a lot of time just sitting in the sun to keep warm. So if you want more active kaiju, why not make them semi-aquatic, like the giant monsters of the 2022 film Sea Beast? The ocean can suspend their large bodies in the water, but they are still able to make brief forays on land to terrorize coastal cities or eat the HMS Victory. You can also look to Earth's biological past to come up with fresh ideas for kaiju that aren't too derivative. For example, instead of a giant ape, why not a giant orangutan like Gigantopithecus black, a primate which could reach heights of 10 feet when standing on its hind legs. In fact, the original 1933 King Kong was only 18 feet tall. In 1949 version of Mighty Joe Young was 12 feet tall, so a smaller scale kaiju might work better for your alternate history. And if you're looking for a more realistic rodin, there are the Quetzalcoatlus, which are basically giant pterodactyls. They are roughly the size of a Cessna, but based on some of the fossils found, some have put the wingspan to 50 to 70 feet in length, which would certainly make them seem like a giant monster to your average human. Sure, none of these animals reach the size of your film kaiju, but minor tweaks to their anatomy, plus encouraging your audience to suspend their disbelief, can help them work in your alternate history. But in all honesty, alternate history is about retelling human history, so ultimately the giant monsters will of course be secondary importance to the humans in the story. Thus, as the alternate historian, it is your job to figure out how humans would adapt to the kaiju running amok, which means one of the first questions you need to ask yourself is, did kaijus exist from the beginning of human civilization, or did they arrive later? This is important as it could impact how people view them. Something that has always been there might be treated more like a natural disaster, while monsters that appear later could create more collective trauma. For example, the chaos caused by the sudden appearance of kaiju could lead to a lot of indirect deaths as society breaks down. Thus, more people might die in those initial years from disease or famine than, say, being stepped on by a giant turtle. But if kaiju were always present in human history, then presumably humanity has learned to live with them like anything else. Other questions you should ask yourself is, how do humans travel with kaiju roaming about? For example, if kaiju are mostly sea-based, then this could severely limit the amount of maritime trade or even fishing. Transcontinental travel could also be extremely difficult if kaiju are tearing up the highways and railroads, although this does mean a certain alternate history trope could become more practical to avoiding kaiju, especially in early modern eras. I'm of course talking about airships, which might be able to simply fly to an altitude where kaiju, even flying ones, can't reach. For example, some World War I era German Zeppelins could reach heights of 21,000 feet. Even flying kaiju might struggle to reach that height without magic. I mean, remember the Quetzalcoatlus I mentioned before? It is believed they can only reach heights of 15,000 feet, but other researchers suggest they may have been too massive and thus mostly glided only short hops. Although this does take some of the suspense out of the unmade Hammer film, Zeppelin versus pterodactyls. Meanwhile, city walls might still be an important form of kaiju deterrence, even in the modern era. You might not know this, but American cities like Boston and New Orleans once had walls, and these might be restored or maintained if kaiju appeared, much like the walls humanity tried to build in the 2013 film Pacific Rim. In fact, during the advent of electricity, these walls may even be upgraded. I mean, just imagine Thomas Edison selling electrified walls as an anti-kaiju measure. Or maybe you could have Nikola Tesla design his famous coils to be placed on walls and send out lightning strikes on unprepared kaiju. Which brings us to another important question you need to ask yourself. Can your kaiju be killed? Remember, kaiju personify a society's fears and anxieties into a destructive, impossible-to-stop monster. So if you want to stay true to that style of storytelling, then pretty much every warrior and weapon you pull from history will be useless. Like, what if the Roman Empire fell, but instead of seeing Rome sacked by the Goths, it got pulverized by a kaiju? This doesn't mean you couldn't tell a compelling story about an unstoppable monster, especially a horror story. I mean, a kaiju that sees you as nothing more than an ant to be stepped on can be terrifying. And while mainstream films can't show too much death and gore for fear of getting an R rating, books can get away with embracing the true bloody horror of what it would be like to experience a kaiju attack, whether in the present, the past, or an alternate timeline. And if your kaiju are radioactive, expect survivors of kaiju attacks to suffer from radiation sickness and increased risk of cancer later in life. Invulnerable kaiju could also mean that human civilization would digress to a more primitive state that survives by being nomadic or hiding from the kaiju, such as in the 2017 animated film Godzilla, Planet of the Monsters. Still, I think a vulnerable but hard to kill kaiju can still make for an interesting story. As a creator, you can showcase human ingenuity in taking down these titans, especially in eras where weapons of mass destruction were not readily available. Thus, you could see militaries make use of batteries of artillery or fleets of big gun battleships in order to take down kaiju. Or, alternatively, they might make use of explosive harpoons. These are actual tools used in whaling to deliver an explosive device into a whale. So, in a timeline with kaiju, these could be even larger in order to break through the tough hide of their targets. And if your kaiju reproduces, baby or juvenile kaiju may also be easier to kill than an adult kaiju. So a single individual armed with something like an elephant gun might be able to help keep the kaiju population down, and thus lower the chances of the next city being destroyed. And let's be honest, it would be awesome to see American president and prolific hunter Theodore Roosevelt take down a kaiju. And don't be afraid to use mecha in your alternate history, like the ones we see in the United States and Japan. Sure, giant robots are just as implausible as giant monsters, but since we are already breaking plausibility here, we might as well have some fun, right? Besides, steam-powered robots are part of early science fiction, like Edward Ellis's 1868 novel, The Steam Man of the Prairies. Plus, there were inventors building literal steam men, like Zadok Daedric's 1868 steam-powered robot that was designed to pull a cart. Now imagine Zadok building one that was several stories tall and used to hunt the kaiju of the Great Plains. Or if you want to keep it somewhat more plausible, you could always draw inspiration from those giant tank designs that are floating around. For example, you got the super heavy tanks like the German Rat or the Soviet T-42, which both look like battleships on treads. There is also the proposed German self-propelled artillery, which is ironically called Monster, which would have been an 82 feet long, 1,800-ton gun that will require a 100-person crew to fire. On second thought, that might be a little too slow and unwieldy to hit a kaiju. Of course, with all the fun we are having, we don't want to lose sight of another common theme to kaiju stories, as in the real monsters are humans. For example, in the Kaiju Preservation Society, the kaijus are basically just animals who won't bother humans if left alone. The real villain of the story, instead, is a tech billionaire who wants to mine the kaijus for something to sell, and they don't care about who dies along the way. Meanwhile, in World War Kaiju, the monsters themselves are controlled by humans, and thus the destruction they wrought only happens because humans tell them to do it. And finally, in the United States and Japan, the biomecha are literally built out of the organic matter of the people tortured and killed in Nazi death camps. Of course, not all the humans in your alternate history are going to be evil. Many will be regular people trying to eke out a life in the shadow of these enormous beasts, and not all of them will be scientists studying the creatures or soldiers fighting them. For example, let's say your kaiju can be killed and is taken down in the middle of a major city. Someone is going to need to dispose of the body, and someone else might pay handsomely to use the remains for food or other raw materials, much like how the whalers of the 18th and 19th century hunted whales in order to sell the blubber to make whale oil. In fact, it might be worth doing some research on whaling when determining how humans would hunt a kaiju. While the career is certainly controversial today, nevertheless, it's a job that requires humans to hunt some of the largest animals on the planet, and sometimes they did it without access to modern weapons. Heck, there's even a centuries-old myth of the devil whale, which is a whale so large it could swallow ships whole and be mistaken for an island, which certainly sounds like an early version of a kaiju. Wait a second, does this mean Moby Dick is a kaiju? The existence of kaiju may even impact major religions. For example, would the Nephilim or Goliath of Judaism and Christianity be reimagined as giant monsters, or would entire new religions arise that worship these creatures as gods? Surprisingly, Pacific Rim, which is perhaps best known for its giant robot monster fights, did take the time to showcase a kaiju-centered religion. And what if, in humanity's efforts to protect itself from these monsters, the kaiju became endangered? Would humans try to find a way to live alongside kaiju, much like some communities live alongside bears or other large predators in our timeline? They could carve out giant nature preserves where kaiju are more than happy to stay. It certainly would be an interesting take on the conservation movement. So, for example, instead of reintroducing wolves to places where they were driven out of, you would be transporting a kaiju to a new home in order to restore the balance of nature. Humans may even find a way to communicate with kaiju or even turn them into protectors. For example, in many Godzilla films, the titular Titan is often portrayed as the protector of Japan. Imagine, if you would, what it would be like if the Lakota people had their own pet kaiju they could call upon when the American cavalry arrived. So in conclusion, kaiju can be a fun and unique way to retell history, but don't stress too much about getting the science right. Kaiju were never meant to be taken that seriously, and even in a genre like alternate history that focuses on plausibility, you should instead try to follow the rule of cool with this one. So please, just focus on telling an interesting story with a good message and maybe just enough real science so that someone would go through the effort to find a scientist to explain how it absolutely could not happen. Well, that's it to say on the subject. If you enjoy what I do, please like, comment, subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitcherich, the Alternate Historian. Happy Halloween.